Let me just start quickly. I told Gracie that I would start with kind of an overview of this topic as I see it, and I'm sure some of you have different views. So I'm based in the United States, but I spend a lot of time in Asia. I've spent probably half or more of my career working with Asia. So it's become an increasingly hot topic. You know, where is going to be the center, as much as anything will be the center of crypto? Will it be the US, or will it be Asia, or will it be Europe? This has become quite a hot topic. And the United States, in my opinion, is in a very problematic situation on crypto regulation. There's a lot of confusion. This has been going on for years, but it's kind of reaching a peak now because the US, the SEC now has several lawsuits against Binance, against Coinbase, and you know, what used to be, it was often, we'd often hear about, you know, crypto projects saying that they were leaving the US or avoiding the US, but I think now that's actually starting to really happen, and I'd love to hear, you know, all of your perspectives on that. It's not so much that the US is strict on crypto, it's that the US is very confusing about crypto. And, you know, for example, we're still arguing about who is regulating crypto. Is it the SEC or is it the CFTC? I've talked to various lawyers in the United States who say we are advising projects to avoid the United States entirely. Again, I don't know if you've heard that. So come to Asia, you have a very different atmosphere here. So Singapore, for years now, people have been talking about Singapore as kind of a model of regulatory clarity. You know, again, stark contrast. But there's some new players in town, or newer players in town. And I think the two that have caught my attention are Japan and Hong Kong. Now, again, neither of these are new. Japan was actually a first mover in crypto. But, you know, for years, Japan suffered a massive hack in 2018, CoinCheck, and Japan kind of went off the radar for a while. And it's recently come back, and Japanese regulators are sending a very welcoming message to the crypto industry. Hong Kong, same thing, recently unveiled a licensing regime for crypto, also sending a very welcoming message to the crypto industry. So we have this very stark contrast. Anyway, I want to open this up, but that's just kind of how I see it. Let's actually start with Michael, because I'm giving kind of like an anecdotal regulatory perspective, but what are you seeing in the data in terms of crypto adoption around the world?
I think data says many different things. So we do a geo index in terms of like where are people owning most crypto, where they're using crypto the most, and so on. Asia is like a huge hub here. I would say like one of the things around Singapore, Vietnam are clearly like high on the list. South America, LATAM is also high on the list there. So they're like, in terms of usage, ownership of crypto and so on, are like really top notch. The US is still actually on high up on the list as well. And I think the interesting thing when you talk about where is the next center of crypto, what's going on there, at the end of the day, crypto is inherently global. It doesn't work unless it truly is global. But if you want to build a company, you have to like find a place to have a headquarter. You need to find a regulatory framework that kind of applies and supports you the best. And I think that's where we are talking about like where's the next opportunity, where should you headquarter, where should you build out your business from. And if I look at the regulatory scene, there was one thing you didn't mention in your list there, and that was Europe. Mm-hmm. And I think that Europe with MiCA has actually probably created the most clarity, and that has given like an opportunity for companies operating out of Europe to really know like in a good detail what they can do and what they cannot do going forward. You can argue that maybe some of that is a little bit overreaching, and that might be that there are some companies choosing to not be in Europe and choose jurisdictions that are more welcoming. If I should pick other jurisdictions that opened up a lot, we've seen Dubai as an area that's clearly been welcoming towards crypto. We speak to regulators there frequently, to the central bank, to VARA, to others there. They really want businesses to move in, but they're also a little bit worried, especially after what happened with FTX, and think about, should we really, shouldn't we, and so on. And I actually think the player that's kind of the dark horse coming in from the east is Hong Kong, where Hong Kong has said like, China clearly pushed crypto away and said we don't want to deal with it, and then they opened the door and put it into Hong Kong. So Hong Kong is like for crypto what gaming and Macau is together. So I see this is going to be a big contestant on the scene in terms of what's going on.
And just your point about Europe, it's true that I mean, I didn't mention Europe that much, but I think the reason is because MiCA's not actually here yet.
In France, you can get registered in Spain, in Italy, in Portugal, in Malta, where I'm based, and so the MiCA is going to come as a regulatory framework that take care of the whole Europe. Where do you base your business versus where you're going to have users, which are almost sometimes two different needs. Dubai is great from a regulatory point of view, but there is no users. There is no domestic users. There are 4 million people, and they are not users of either utility or barely trading. Japan and Korea are massive retail market. I live in Malta, 500,000 people. It's great for the business, but it's not good for the users because we don't have customers in Malta. So it's finding the right balance between where you're based and what you are targeting.
Let's talk about Dubai for a second. That's where you're based, right?
Yeah.
So do you agree with that assessment, that there's no users in Dubai?
So whichever jurisdiction you look at, banking is going to be a problem. In Dubai, the central bank of the UAE is based in Abu Dhabi. They're a lot more conservative. The UAE is currently on the Financial Action Task Force grey list.
That's a really interesting point. Can you just clarify what you mean by the banking problem? Do you mean, for example, that like crypto exchanges can't get bank accounts, or what?
Yeah, crypto exchanges, crypto companies. I mean, if you're looking to interact with the US dollar system in any way, which, let's face it, every crypto company has to do, whether they like it or not, banking is going to be cut off or made difficult, then they have a real problem. And that is unfortunately still the case. You know, they're working on it in the UAE and elsewhere, but it is still a big problem.
We have 340 employees. We have 150 in Malta, yet to pay our employees, we don't have bank account in Malta. Because we cannot get, and we don't have bank account in France, we don't have bank account in traditional countries-ish. We need to be more flexible, and it's a problem. It's a problem because how do you settle payments? How do you get money from your customers? How do you pay your bills with this? And when you work in crypto, you're like you are an evil that we put in a corner because you're a bad person. And then if you're in Dubai, which is, I think that's what you were saying, it's in the grey list of the FATF,
yeah.
Exactly, which Malta was actually till last year or this year. So it is a challenge it's already a challenge to work in an industry that is difficult, but then you have extra complication because of the base you're choosing sometimes.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point, because sometimes, you get all this press about like crypto-friendly hubs like Dubai, but then there's like kind of the small print, like about banking. So
exactly, yeah exactly.
I just want to bring Annabelle into this conversation because Hong Kong was mentioned. And Hong Kong, actually, there were some headlines about Hong Kong regulators basically encouraging banks to work with crypto firms. Now, Annabelle, I know you're not based in Hong Kong anymore. Now you're here in Singapore, but you were in Hong Kong. And I'd love to hear your thoughts about like, what is the situation in Hong Kong? Because it's actually not exactly as it appears, right? I mean, Hong Kong is also getting a lot of press for being super crypto friendly, but when you look at it closely, it's very strict, and some of it is quite narrow, the regulation. For example, there's really only 2 exchanges that have official exchange licenses, and they're very limited in what they can trade, and it's only spot. So I guess, I'd just be curious to hear, like, do you see Hong Kong really as becoming a crypto hub, and how does it compare to Singapore, where you are now?
During the last cycle, actually a lot of the exchanges were based in Hong Kong back in the 2016, 2017 era, and some of them are not around anymore. So you did have that very vibrant crypto community back then, and obviously there is the mainland crackdown, and so right now, definitely from the headlines, you're seeing a lot of activities coming, but we're not getting as much clarity, at least until next year, when we're seeing more licenses being approved, because right now it's still the same 2 names. And we're thinking about the banking problem is the same. I think at least the China state-owned banks, they are under some sort of directive to be more friendly towards Web3 crypto firms. But for us, as a liquidity provider, as a client-facing service provider, getting our operating account, maybe that's feasible once you have the license, but then to get a client account, which means you can actually settle to third-party clients, I think that would actually be still very difficult. And that's the case, I think, in the rest of the world as well, in the US, in Dubai, and even in Singapore. So in Singapore, we have acquired a licensed platform called Sparrow last year, and the acquisition is completed this year. So because of that, Sparrow itself can open Singapore bank accounts, but the process of which is still, you still have to go through enhanced due diligence, So it's never easy, but I think the banking infrastructure has definitely improved over the years, and that at least now once you are licensed, for example, in Hong Kong, in Singapore, in Japan at least, you still have a path towards having these bank accounts.
Just to touch on the regulatory side though, we made a pretty conscious choice of actually being very B2B, and I think it makes it easier to be B2B versus B2C. I think there's a lot of the regulation is very much there to protect essentially the retail investors. We did find that after getting the FCA registration in the UK that it is a bit smoother in terms of getting bank accounts. We as a business very much rely on as frictionless as possible banking and so on, because we did trade very, very high frequency, so we now trade about 16-20% of all spot volumes. That means that we need to be able to transfer cash in and out quite quickly, essentially billions every day. There is a dimension where there's geographies like in the UK where they don't really want to regulate it. They just want to have, essentially make sure that the bad agents are out of the system, which is good. So being French-born, I'm still quite in touch with a few French teams, and we see even, new stable coins being set up in France. So there is a framework there. Essentially, I spent about 3 months in South Korea to discover the industry over there. There's a lot of potential in many locales, but it's actually still very difficult to see how we actually do business there. And then it's a mix of local customs, it's a mix of some incumbents who want to protect their turf, essentially. There's a few countries where there's FX controls and such, and even we discussed in Japan where there's clarity. So essentially, Japan is quite interesting from the perspective of FTX because they had a good experience with FTX. They essentially had seen enough hacks before and had a framework that actually worked quite well, and then people who had customers of FTX Japan actually got their money back, I think already. So it's a general geography where there's business to be done, but then some of the more exciting, I would say, geography like South Korea are pretty. We see this with Alex.
I feel like Korea sometimes is like the most sort of like underestimated market in a way. Like you don't hear about it that much. I mean, you hear about it in crypto, but you had some interesting thoughts about Korea.
Yeah, one of the, I think, missing stuff in the crypto space is there is not enough English coverage of what's happening in Asia. There is too much bad news about what's happening in US, which killed the mood of everybody, while actually there is so much thing happening in Asia, in the rest of the world, and that's not covered enough because main publications are actually Americans, which is a mistake, which may gonna change very time soon. But
I cover what's happening in Asia.
yeah.
But yes, I agree with you. I agree with the broader point.
And in Korea, for us, for example, we have 20% of our Chiliz token holders that are more or less Korean on Upbit as like really.
So yeah, I think you were saying. Would you say Korea is like your largest market?
As token holders yet, but not as utility, and that's where there is a difference. Okay. The difference between Japan and Korea, at least for us, is in Japan we had users that use the utility of our platform, which is fan engagement with fan tokens and sports, etc. While in Korea was really much more about trading for now. But because the regulation also block companies like us to really do the custody of the tokens in the country, and because as a company that works with legacy brands like we are in the sports industry, we have to be more careful than offshore exchanges or stuff like this. So, but Korea is, if you look at the trading volume, we are in an exchange event, so if you look at the trading volume of Korea, from a retail perspective, it's as big as Binance globally, or almost as big as Binance globally, and that makes a big difference.
Yeah.
If Upbit was allowed to actually really do business outside of Korea, which they can't right now, they will be as competitive as Binance.com.
Right, you're saying that your largest market for holders, right,
yes,
is in Korea. That's like a pretty interesting data point that probably a lot of people don't realize, and just like the power of Korean retail traders to kind of push up tokens. I think sometimes people don't really appreciate that. And I think you're right also, like in general, yes, there's not a lot of English coverage of what's happening in Asia, but that sort of brings me to my question about the US, and this is kind of for everyone. Is the US still relevant in crypto? Like, is it, I mean, Michael said that, US still shows up, but like, what is the role of the US in crypto? Because I think, yeah, it's true, like American coverage is often like overly America-centric, but then on the other side of it, you can say, well, is the US really that important in crypto anymore? I'm just curious what you guys all think.
If you look at investments going into crypto from investors, like where companies end up building their headquarters or like having big development teams, the majority of stable coins is based on US dollars, so the US have some importance. We are still measuring, the blockchain is dollarized, it's not like euroized, or it's not like any other currency there, it's basically everything is measured in dollars. So I would say, I think we are waiting for the US, and I think while we are waiting for the US becomes slightly less important by the day, but they start up here. So they can afford to become less important by the day, and I think that's basically how it is, that like the second there will be like amazing regulatory clarity in the US, this conversation would completely stop in all of this, and we're all waiting for that because it is kind of a financial center. I think there's another thing that's been at play here, right? Because we saw with the war in Ukraine and with sanctions that's been applied left, right, and center all over the globe, we've seen that the value of the dollar and the dollar system, that the importance of the dollars has like been diminished in many ways. And I think that's a concern, that like sanctions work to some extent, but not always, so there might be other measures that are better. And I think that that's another trend that we are seeing at the same time that basically takes the US a little bit out of control because they have hit very hard with the sanctions.
Just from sort of product development or research-driven development perspective, I think US is still no doubt the lead globally. They're still mostly US or to some extent Europe-based. So I think Asia still has a bit of catch-up to do, and I think that just speaks to different kind of developer base. So here in Asia, you see a bit more kind of e-commerce, payment, gaming type focused developers versus in Bay Area, you know, the conversation was a lot about you know, ZK or any kind of modularity or a lot of that more deep tech or AI, right? More deep tech kind of conversations, and we as an industry still need a lot of that. And I think even San Francisco and New York as a crypto hub, still very high quality developers, still a lot of liquidity, still a lot of funds to be deployed. So yeah, there's no doubt the US is still relevant, but to your point, right, maybe it is, a lot of them are in wait and hold period to see how, you know, this political cycle plays out. But so in the meantime, maybe there's more to do in Asia, and that's why I think all of us are here in Singapore today. But I wouldn't dismiss the relevance of the US.
Another thing to bear in mind when it comes to the US is not only is a lot of the money there from an institutional point of view, also from a retail point of view, there are still a lot of retail investors in crypto. But I think another important, and this is something to talk about sort of on a general kind of, on a general overview of regulations, is that the US still has an enormous amount of influence over, I guess, the third arm of the regulatory landscape, if you like, which is these international organizations, the likes of the Bank for International Settlements, the Financial Action Task Force, which we mentioned earlier, the World Bank, the IMF, etc., etc. These organizations, okay, they're international, but they are still, they do fall largely, I think, within the US sphere of influence. And like it or not, the US still has an enormous amount of sway, largely because the dollar is still the world's reserve currency and is going to be for a very long time. And as long as that situation persists, then US influence will be massive over the crypto industry because of these international organizations that it has a lot of say in how they run. And these organizations are not generally all that crypto friendly. I mean, the IMF, for instance, when it made a big loan to Argentina recently, one of the stipulations of that loan was you have to stifle crypto adoption. And that's a big deal, especially in a country like Argentina, which is kind of, in many ways, kind of ground zero for crypto adoption. It's one of the you know, the classic cases where you know, Bitcoin actually fixes this. So as long as that persists, the US is going to have an enormous amount of influence. Some of it positive, some of it you could argue a bit more malign.
Well, first of all, I'm happy to hear that the U.S. is still relevant as an American. It's good to hear. But I think there's a larger problem here, and I'd be curious what you all think about it. I think one of the reasons why crypto has a problem in the U.S., a lot of people like to blame Gary Gensler and the SEC like it's this one guy, and I think that's overly simplified because I think people in Congress aren't necessarily friendly toward crypto, and a lot of mainstream Americans probably don't have the best impression of crypto either. And I feel like you know, if you look at the countries or the jurisdictions that embraced crypto, they tend to have a reason for it, right? You know, like you look at Singapore and they're like, okay, they're looking at the future of financial innovation, or you look at Hong Kong, and I think Hong Kong has a lot of economic reasons for embracing crypto. They think they want to attract business and talent. Or you look at Japan, you often hear at Japan that people say Japan kind of missed the Web 2 era and Web 3 is their opportunity. There's not really that argument in the US, I think, you know, like there's not enough of a pro-crypto, like why we need this, and I think because of that, regulators tend to see it more as a threat. And I'm just curious to throw that out there because this is kind of a problem around the world, right? If you want regulators to embrace crypto, they have to see an opportunity, right? And I think in some places, they don't see the opportunity and they just see the downside. They just see the potential of another Terra Luna, another FTX, you know.
US, it's going to become a defensive move. They're actually going to have to embrace crypto because everybody else does.
Right.
And originally it should have been the other way around, where they should have been the forefront of innovation. And the reason behind China and many other countries in Asia embracing more and more crypto, including Europe with MiCA, is actually to create a counterpower to US. So at some point, US will have to embrace it, but as a defensive move.
Right.
So it's a completely different dynamic. And in our case, there will always be sports fans in US. Right now, we cannot serve Americans because there is no regulatory clarity. It's an issue because we invested a lot. Yet, there will be always sports fans in the US. So when regulation will be clear, companies like us and others will be able to come back from a consumer point of view and deliver services there at some point.
Because most people are used to having a functioning currency that doesn't get devalued every few years. And you say that to someone in the UK, I mean, the pound has been devaluing just over a very long period of time. So most people don't have really that frame of reference. So you try to explain why crypto gives you an alternative to the system, and in their eyes, the system, it tends to work okay. So why do they need something else?
I think crypto originally, like in the Bitcoin days and so on, we're all talking about like, this is solved for remittances, this is like against like a current national currency that doesn't really work. But I think there's also another thing happening is that crypto, just one fun fact on data, right? More than half of all value moved on blockchains is stablecoins. So not crypto anymore, it's dollarized. It's actually national currencies moving on blockchains. It's around 75% right now, so it's a huge amount. That's only going to grow. So crypto will become the rails of finance, and it will become the infrastructure of everything of finance. And I think that's also the time where in countries that might be more developed, that has a better working financial system, where it becomes much more obvious for them to move that financial system to something else. And I think that's creeping in slowly all over, also in the US. I think for the throwback to the crypto time, where crypto was just crypto, there is this concept of passive income in the US, and that's like trying to think about investments and passive income. That's bigger than in any country in Europe, for example, where people think about another way of earning money. And crypto has tapped into that narrative in the US. So every Uber driver in Miami will tell you about their crypto investments, as they will tell you about their real estate investments and like any other things. So they're basically putting it into the category of passive income.
How would people in Asia look at that? I mean, do they sort of look at it from a point of view of passive income, or what's their way of growing their wealth?
Right. If you look at Singapore and Hong Kong, the more developed markets, where people have already accumulated wealth, then yes, they're thinking about investment in a more rational way and about growing their principal, right? But if you're looking at other parts of Asia, Korea, or Southeast Asia, actually a lot of reason that they are very well adopted into crypto is because they're actually looking for the initial phase of the wealth accumulation. They want to get rich fast, right? That's why you're seeing a lot of the crazy trading activities out of these more emerging markets, because of where the treasury bills are at, right? If you can earn risk-free 5.5 or more, then it's actually harder to convince the capital that are sitting in Singapore or Hong Kong to deploy too much into crypto-related investments at the moment, because the risk return might not justify it. But I do think for the rest of the Asia, then they probably think about this very differently. They're still trading into altcoins and trying to look for ways to get rich.
In Korea, Japan, and Southeast Asia, people really fight to exist and to survive in their own society, where there is so much competition for a job, for everything, and therefore at least what we've seen, and I'm not talking about Chiliz, but rather what we've seen and learned there is people who trade crypto in Korea and in Japan is, as you said, it's a way to get rich, or at least a hope to get rich and to make money. To
yeah,
actually
for some people, maybe their only hope.
And it's to actually have a chance to not be like your neighbor. It's to have a chance to not live with your parents. It's really very basic, but it's that. And on top of that, you have also the thrill of trading. I don't say that often, but there is also a reason why in Japan and Korea, especially, trading works. It's because online gambling is illegal. So it's an alternative to a certain thrill.
The funny example I like to use is Aptos are really, really popular in Korea.
Aptos, yeah.
Because the ticker is APT, which essentially stands for aparte in Korean, which means an apartment. So people are just buying into Aptos, thinking that we'll make money from the token to actually buy an apartment and such.
I'm officially announcing we're renaming BTS Chiliz, and I'm sure it will work very well.
But there's these two angles where, because there's like in many Asian cultures, there's a tendency to be, gamblers essentially. There's a lot of reluctance from the local authorities to basically just open that market. We all hope that there will be a framework around it and actually, some safety net that can be useful there. When
you consider that the most sort of aggressive regulatory environment is the US, where people are actually using crypto for passive income to grow their wealth, and yet some of the more open regulatory environments are in jurisdictions where crypto still seems to be basically not far removed from gambling. That seems to be a pretty odd situation to be in. So I mean, I wonder how that develops.
Yeah, that's an interesting point. Do you guys agree with that? That's an interesting point. I mean, if you look at some of the, if you look at Singapore, for example, Singapore is really interesting because they definitely make that distinction between okay, we're promoting digital innovation, but we don't like speculation, right? So there are a few places that actually draw that line where they say that, So, and I mean, even Korea, interestingly enough, and again, I'd be interested in your thoughts. I don't know if I would characterize Korean regulation as particularly friendly. And in some ways not super friendly. So yeah, I think most governments, and then obviously you go to China, right? Mainland China, which is probably the most unfriendly of them all, and precisely because of that, because they don't like retail speculation. So I don't know. It's an interesting point, though.
I think in Korea there is more legal case than in the US, but it's because of the nature, I suppose, of the traders there, where you actually, regulation is not always bad. It's also to protect people. Mm-hmm. So there is also a reason why online gambling is regulated. It's to protect people. It's not about freedom and libertarian or whatever. You can harm people. So I think you have territories and countries where there is a need to have framework that protect their people.
I guess if you have a positive regulatory environment, then you give crypto a chance to grow, to be more than just a speculative asset, to thrive to fulfill the actual uses that these projects are built for.
There is one thing that matters: taxes. As soon as the government will figure out how they can tax you and us, everything will be regulated, and that room will be filled of people.
Because Japan is seen as very friendly with regulation, but has very onerous crypto taxes, or just taxes in general. So yeah. It's a good point. Annabelle, were you going to say something? Or?
Regulatory clarity and regulatory friendliness is two different things. Right?
Yes.
And what we are asking for is more clarity, which I think is currently lacking in the US. If you look at Japan, it's actually quite stringent, right?
Oh, yeah.
We ran a license exchange for a year, and the requirements on the exchange side, and then of course on the tax burden of the users. I wouldn't say it's exactly friendly, but it's clear. At least you have a path to operate a business.
The countries that are seen as friendly or crypto hubs, in some ways are the most strict, right? I think people hear friendly and they're like, oh, I can just go to that country and do whatever I want, which is completely not the case, right? The countries that are seen as the most advanced, or the jurisdictions like Hong Kong, not easy at all. Singapore, not easy at all. Mika, not easy at all. Dubai, not easy. These are the friendly places. There is a little bit of a downside. Some people would say that it's hard for businesses to be profitable sometimes.
New York is a good example of a regulation with a bit license where it was actually pretty tough, maybe overreaching regulation.
The bit license, yeah.
But because that the market and the opportunity in New York was so big, it kind of didn't matter as much. So if you have a very clear regulation that's a little bit overreaching, you can kind of afford to do so in a region where there's a big enough like custom potential and like earnings potential, so then you can do it.